I know exactly who you are. I have known exactly who you are for 3 years. And I have spent most of that time finding you considerably less interesting than you find yourself. What are you talking about?
He had watched her for 8 months from a careful, disciplined distance. He had told himself every single day that watching was enough. Then a man raised his hand to her face in a room full of 500 people, and every rule Jae-won Oh had ever made for himself stopped applying. If you've ever watched someone you love get treated like they don't matter, and felt the exact moment your restraint ran out, stay until the end. This one's for you. Before we go anywhere, if you're new here, hit subscribe, because we tell stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into it. Sable Owens had a talent for making herself small in rooms that were too large for her, and the Haverford Gala was the largest room she had ever been asked to disappear inside. She was there as a guest of the Meridian Foundation, the nonprofit she'd spent the last 4 years building into something real, a financial literacy organization serving women coming out of the prison system, women who had been handed a debt load and a bus pass, and told essentially to figure it out. Meridian had pulled in enough attention this year to earn an invitation to the Haverford, which was the kind of charity event that used the word charity, the way some people use the word humble, technically accurately, and with a great deal of money spent on proving the opposite. Sable wore a dress she'd spent 3 months of careful savings on, deep burgundy, floor length, the kind of dress designed to make a curvy woman feel like she occupied her body as a choice rather than an apology. Her hair was natural, pinned back at the crown with a few curls left loose at her temples, and she had walked into the Haverford ballroom with the particular composure of someone who had learned the hard way to look at ease in rooms that weren't built with her in mind. She did not notice Jae-won Oh until she had been in the room for approximately 20 minutes. This was not unusual. Most people didn't notice Jae-won Oh until he wanted to be noticed, which was considerably rarer than his position warranted. He was standing near the far end of the bar with a glass of something he hadn't touched, and the particular stillness of a man who was simultaneously the most dangerous person in the room and the least interested in anyone knowing it. What was unusual was that Jae-won Oh noticed her immediately. He had been doing so in one form or another for 8 months. It had started at a city council hearing on housing policy of all places, a meeting Jae-won attended because 2 of the blocks under discussion sat above infrastructure his organization had quietly funded, and a meeting Sable attended because Meridian's women needed affordable housing more urgently than they needed almost anything else she could advocate for. She had spoken for 3 minutes without notes and dismantled a city official's arguments so cleanly and with such evident restraint that Jae-won had looked up from the document he'd been annotating and not looked back down for the rest of the session. He had learned her name from a foundation directory that evening. He had not introduced himself because introducing himself would have required acknowledging that he'd been paying attention, and acknowledging that would have required doing something about it, something he was not at that point prepared to do. What followed was 8 months of a pattern he was not proud of and could not seem to stop. He attended 2 more council hearings. He quietly directed an anonymous donation toward Meridian's annual budget, routed through a shell entity that couldn't be traced back to him. He made certain through the particular network of information his organization maintained without anyone asking it to, that the 2 men who had been making life difficult for Meridian's lease renewal found themselves facing unexpected complications in their own business interests. He did none of it with any intention of ever telling her. He did it the way he did most things, efficiently, from a distance, with the full understanding that a man in his position had no clean way to walk into a woman's life without bringing the weight of everything he'd built into it with him. He was 34 years old, the head of an organization that had made more enemies than he could comfortably count, and the only person who had ever made him consider whether the distance he'd maintained from everything that actually mattered was discipline or its more expensive cousin, cowardice. Sable Owens in a burgundy dress, standing at the edge of a ballroom that didn't fully deserve her, was making him consider it again. If you're already hooked, drop a comment with what you think is about to happen. I love reading your guesses before the story gets there. Now, back to it. The man who approached her 40 minutes into the event was named Corbin Ashby, 43, third-generation wealth, the kind of handsome that had never been required to develop any personality to compensate for it. He was one of the Haverford Gala's primary corporate sponsors, which meant he moved through the event with the unchallenged ease of a man who believed his check had purchased more than a seat at the table. Jae-won recognized him without needing to think about it. His organization and Ashby Capital had crossed paths twice in the last 3 years, both times in ways that had ended poorly for Ashby's timeline and somewhat better for Jae-won's. Corbin Ashby was not a man who forgot professional friction, and he was not, As far as Jae-won had observed, a man who managed his reactions to it particularly well in private. What Jae-won did not know, and would not learn until later, was that Corbin Ashby had history with Sable Owens that predated the evening. 3 years of it, beginning with a board seat he'd arranged for Meridian and ending with conditions attached to that seat that Sable had declined, firmly and publicly, at a foundation meeting 6 months ago. Ashby had not taken the declining particularly well. Men who tied generosity to obligation rarely did. Jae-won watched from the bar as Ashby approached Sable with the particular smile of a man who had decided that a public event was sufficient cover for a private grievance. He watched Sable's posture shift, the barely perceptible straightening of someone who had just identified a threat and was deciding how to handle it with minimum damage to the room around her. He watched her smile tighten into the specific expression he had come to recognize, over 8 months of careful observation, as the face she wore when she was managing something she would rather not have to manage at all. He set down his untouched drink and began moving toward them, slowly, with no plan beyond being close enough to do something if something needed to be done. He told himself this was operational instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive and functioning in a world that rewarded neither hesitation nor visibility. He did not examine it more carefully than that. He was still 12 feet away when the conversation between Sable and Corbin Ashby escalated past the point where it could be managed quietly. He could not hear the words from where he stood. The ballroom string quartet was cooperative in exactly the wrong direction, but he could read the geometry of the exchange with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years studying the mechanics of how power moved between people in rooms. Ashby leaned in. Sable stepped back. Ashby's hand moved to her arm, the grip visible even from across the room in the way grips are visible when they're tighter than the situation warrants. Sable said something that removed whatever smile had been on Ashby's face. Ashby said something back. Then he raised his hand and brought it across her cheek with the flat, casual authority of a man who had never once in his entire life believed there would be consequences. The sound of it was lost in the music. The motion was not. Jae-won covered the remaining 12 feet in 4 seconds and had Corbin Ashby's throat in his hand before the 5th second had fully elapsed. The string quartet played on for approximately 3 more beats before the nearest violinist noticed what was happening, and the music stuttered into silence, the way sound always stutters when a room collectively understands that something has shifted beyond the point of polite recovery. "Did you just—" Jae-won's voice was low, so low it was almost inaudible and somehow more frightening for it. The particular register of a man who had stopped needing volume to communicate intent a long time ago. His hand was not squeezing, not yet, simply present around Ashby's throat with the calm, unhurried certainty of a man who had made considerably more serious decisions than this one, and had never once regretted them. In a room full of 500 people, you raised your hand to her face. Ashby's composure, whatever remained of it, was doing its best. "Get your hands off me. Do you have any idea who—" "I know exactly who you are," Jae-won said. "I have known exactly who you are for 3 years, and I have spent most of that time finding you considerably less interesting than you find yourself. I am going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer it." The hand around Ashby's throat tightened, just fractionally, not enough to harm, precisely enough to clarify. "Are you going to walk out of this room under your own power, or are you going to require assistance?" The room was entirely silent now. 500 people, and the only sound was the faint clink of someone's champagne glass being set down too quickly somewhere in the back. Sable's hand was pressed to her cheek, her expression caught between shock and a fury she was clearly, visibly fighting to contain. She was looking at Jae-won with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not relief, something more complicated than either. The particular look of a woman reassessing a stranger in real time, and not fully certain what to do with what she was finding. Ashby made his decision. He walked under his own power toward the exit, with the rigid back of a man who had been publicly humiliated and was already constructing the version of events he would tell later. 2 of his own people fell in beside him without being asked. Jae-won let him go. He turned then toward Sable. The first thing she said to him was not thank you. It was, "I had it handled." Despite everything, the adrenaline still moving through him, the 500 pairs of eyes still pointed in their direction, the string quartet cautiously beginning to play again somewhere behind them. Something that might have been, in a less controlled man, a smile moved across Jae-won's face. "I know you did," he said quietly. "I interfered anyway. I apologize for the spectacle." "Do you?" She lowered her hand from her cheek, the mark still visible against her dark skin, and looked at him with the same directness she'd brought to that city council hearing 8 months ago. "You don't look particularly sorry." "I'm sorry about the spectacle," Jae-won said. "I am not sorry about the intervention. Those are two separate things, and I find I can only apologize honestly for one of them." They ended up on the terrace. Not by any explicit agreement, the ballroom had become, in the aftermath of the incident, a place where 500 people were simultaneously pretending not to look at them, which was its own kind of suffocation, but by the unspoken mutual understanding of two people who both needed air and were apparently willing to find it in the same direction. The city spread below them, warm and indifferent, doing nothing to resolve the particular tension of standing beside a stranger who had just put his hand around another man's throat on your behalf. "You knew his name," Sable said. She was leaning against the terrace railing, her champagne glass held loosely in one hand, looking out at the lights rather than at him. "Before I said anything, you knew exactly who he was. Corbin Ashby, Ashby Capital. Board of 14 companies, primary sponsor of this event, history of treating his financial contributions as purchase orders rather than donations." Jae-won stood beside her at a careful distance, hands in his jacket pockets. "We've crossed paths professionally." "That's not what I meant." She turned to look at him then, and he understood immediately that she was considerably sharper than the situation might have allowed her to be, and that she was not going to let him navigate around the actual question. "I meant you knew he had history with me. You were already moving toward us before he touched me. I saw you." Jae-won was quiet for a moment, not the guilty quiet of a man caught in something, but the considered quiet of a man deciding how much truth the moment warranted. He had spent 8 months maintaining a distance specifically designed to avoid exactly this conversation. He found, standing on a terrace with the mark of another man's hand still visible on her face, that the distance had collapsed so completely he couldn't reconstruct it, even if he'd wanted to. "I recognize the dynamic," he said carefully. "I've seen men like Ashby in rooms like this before. I positioned myself in case something needed to be done. That's a very controlled way to describe what you did in there. I am, generally, a very controlled person. You had his throat. He hit you." Something moved through Jae-won's voice on those 3 words. Not anger exactly, but its colder and more permanent cousin, the particular tone of a man stating a fact that he intends to carry with him for a very long time. "Whatever controlled looks like for me, it doesn't include watching that happen and doing nothing." Sable studied him for a long moment, the city lights catching the side of her face, the mark on her cheek fading but still visible. "I don't know your name," she said finally. "Jae-won Oh." She absorbed this with the particular stillness of someone running a name through a mental database and finding more results than they expected. "You fund infrastructure on the east side of the city, anonymously through a holding company most people haven't connected back to you yet." It was his turn to study her. "Most people haven't." "I'm not most people. Meridian's women live on those blocks. I pay attention to who improves them and why." She turned back to the city lights, something shifting in her expression. There was also an anonymous donation to Meridian's operating budget 14 months ago, routed through an entity called Sable Horizon Holdings, which is a name I found interesting, given my own name. Jae-won said nothing. The silence confirmed what the words would have, and 2 of the men who were blocking our lease renewal had a remarkably bad quarter, starting about 3 weeks after they first applied pressure. She said it conversationally without accusation, the tone of someone presenting evidence they've already fully processed. "Corbin Ashby being here tonight with me in the same room. Did you know he would be?" "I knew the guest list," Jae-won said. "I knew your name was on it. I knew his name was on it. I knew you had history because I make it my business to know things that might become relevant." A pause. "I told myself coming tonight was a routine attendance for a man in my position. I was not fully honest with myself about that." If you're watching this and thinking about someone you've quietly looked out for without ever saying so, drop a comment. You know who you are. Now, back to the story. Sable was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that Jae-won began constructing the sentence he would use to give her a graceful exit from the conversation. A practiced neutral withdrawal that would leave her free to walk back into the ballroom and make whatever she wanted of the evening without him complicating it further. She spoke before he could. "How long?" she said. 8 months, since the city council housing hearing in October." "You watched me for 8 months without introducing yourself." "Yes." "You donated to my foundation. You cleared obstacles from my path. You showed up tonight knowing I would be here." She turned to face him fully, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't read easily. Not anger, not flattery, something more searching than either. Why didn't you just say something? 8 months ago, at the hearing. What was the reason for all of that distance? The honest answer was complicated in ways that required more courage to say out loud than he generally permitted himself. Because men in my position don't walk into women's lives cleanly, he said. Whatever I bring with me isn't just me. It's everything I've built, everything I've done to build it, every enemy that comes attached. I didn't think I had the right to put that in your path when you'd spent 4 years building something extraordinary specifically on your own terms, without owing anyone anything. So instead you moved things around in my life without my knowledge or consent. Yes. He didn't offer a defense of it because he didn't have one that would hold up to the scrutiny she was applying. I am aware that those two positions are in direct tension with each other. I was aware of it at the time. I did it anyway because doing nothing while you faced obstacles I had the means to clear felt like a worse option, and telling you felt like something I hadn't earned the right to yet. And tonight? Walking into that room tonight? What had changed? Nothing had changed. I hadn't earned anything. I came anyway because I'd run out of patience for the version of this where I stayed at a careful distance and called it consideration. His voice had dropped quieter now, stripped of the careful control he usually brought to every word. And then he hit you, and the distance stopped being a position I was capable of maintaining regardless of whether it was the right one. Sable looked at him for a long, steady moment. You're a complicated person, Jae-won Oh. I know. I haven't decided yet whether what you've done for the last 8 months is the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me, or a significant overreach that I should be considerably more unsettled by. Both of those things can be true simultaneously, he said. I'm not asking you to resolve it tonight. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, plain, matte black, a single phone number printed on it in small type. I'm asking you to take this and decide in your own time whether the conversation we just had is one you want to continue having. She looked at the card for a moment without taking it. Then she looked at him. You moved things in my life without my knowledge, she said quietly. Whatever I decide about you, I need you to understand that if this becomes anything at all, that can never happen again. No quiet interventions, no anonymous rooting, no decisions made on my behalf without my knowing. I have spent 4 years building something that belongs entirely to me, and I will not share my life with someone who sees that as something to manage rather than something to respect. Understood, Jae-won said, completely and without reservation. She took the card. One more thing, she said, sliding it into her small clutch without looking at it again. The donation, Sable Horizon Holdings. She looked up at him with something that might, in a different light, have been the beginning of something warmer than the rest of the evening had contained. Was the name intentional? A pause. Yes. That's either very sweet or slightly alarming. I've been told those two things are difficult to separate in my case. She laughed, short, genuine, surprised out of her despite herself, and something in Jae-won's chest shifted position in a way he was going to be processing for considerably longer than the remainder of the evening. Good night, Jae-won, she said, and walked back into the ballroom with her champagne glass and her burgundy dress and the particular composure of a woman who had been hit in the face and handed a phone number in the same hour and was, apparently, processing both with equal steadiness. He stayed on the terrace for a while after she'd gone, looking at the city, feeling the specific, unfamiliar weight of having told the truth about something he'd been carrying quietly for 8 months. It felt, he decided, considerably better than the distance had. She called him 4 days later, not the next day. She was not, as she had made clear on the terrace, a woman who made decisions before she'd finished thinking them through, but 4 days later, at 11 in the morning, while she was sitting at her desk at Meridian's office with a cup of coffee she'd been reheating twice and a stack of grant applications she had entirely stopped reading. I've been thinking about something you said, she started without preamble, when he answered on the second ring. Only one thing? Don't be charming yet. I haven't decided about you. Understood. What were you thinking about? You said you didn't think you had the right to put what you bring with you into my path. She paused, choosing her next words with the same precision she brought to everything. I've been running Meridian for 4 years. I work with women coming out of incarceration, women who are fighting debt collectors and landlords and parole officers, and former partners who don't want them to succeed. I spend every day in the vicinity of situations that most people in my tax bracket would cross the street to avoid. I am not someone who needs to be protected from complicated. Another pause. I needed to say that. I heard it, Jae-won said. I'm not sure I fully absorbed 8 months ago the difference between protecting someone from complicated and deciding on their behalf that they couldn't handle it. Those aren't the same thing, and I treated them as though they were. No, they're not the same thing at all. A beat of quiet, warmer than the ones that had preceded it. Have you eaten lunch? He hadn't. He told her so. There's a place 3 blocks from your office on West 19th, she said. They make a jollof rice that will change your life. I'll be there at 12:30 if you want to come. He was there at 12:15. What followed over the next 3 weeks was, by any objective measure, the most honest series of conversations Jae-won had engaged in since his mother had died 7 years earlier and temporarily relieved him of the ability to maintain any of his usual distances. They met for lunch 4 times. They talked on the phone twice, once for 40 minutes about housing policy, and once for an hour and a half about nothing in particular, which was the more significant of the 2 conversations, for reasons neither of them acknowledged directly. He told her what he actually did, fully, without the euphemisms he usually employed with people who weren't inside his world. She listened without flinching, not because she was performing toughness, he understood, but because she had genuinely meant what she said on the terrace about not needing protection from complicated. She told him about Corbin Ashby. The full version, the board seat, the conditions attached to it, the 6 months of escalating pressure after she declined, the 3 separate events at which he had engineered a chance to discuss it further, in ways that were designed to look accidental. She told him about the gala, about knowing Ashby would be there, about deciding to attend anyway because she was done reorganizing her professional life around a man who had mistaken her courtesy for weakness. He was going to find out eventually, she said, over coffee at the end of the 3rd lunch, that my courtesy and my softness are not the same thing. He found out slightly faster than he planned. Jae-won said, because of you. Because of you, first. You said something to him that removed his smile before he raised his hand. Whatever you said landed before I did. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but its more private, more real predecessor. I told him that his foundation's tax records had an irregularity I'd found interesting enough to mention to a friend in the DA's office. Which is true. I found it 6 months ago, and I've been waiting for the right moment. Jae-won looked at her for a long moment, something that might have been admiration settling into his expression with the comfortable weight of something that had actually been there for a while. You came to that gala with your own leverage already prepared. I'm a woman who runs an organization for people the system has already chewed through once, she said. I learned a long time ago to walk into rooms with more than one exit prepared. He found he had nothing to add to that. He found he didn't want to add anything, that the particular satisfaction of watching her be exactly who she was in front of him required no commentary from his side at all. Hey, if you're still with us, subscribe if you haven't yet and drop a like on this video. We're building something real over here and every one of you is part of that. Now, let's finish this. Ashby's retaliation arrived on a Thursday 16 days after the gala, in the form of an anonymous tip to a financial news outlet, suggesting that Meridian's most recent donor report contained discrepancies inconsistent with their registered nonprofit status. The story went live at 7 in the morning. By 8, Sable had read it, identified the 3 specific data points that had been deliberately misrepresented, and was already on the phone with Meridian's attorney. She called Jae-won at 8:15. Not for help, she was explicit about that immediately, in a way that told him she had thought about how to have this conversation before making it. I'm calling because you're going to find out anyway, and I'd rather you hear it from me, she said, and because I need you to understand that this is mine to handle, not yours. I understand. Jae-won. Her voice was even but firm. I need you to mean that. Not the version of meaning it where you quietly make calls on my behalf that I don't know about. The actual version where you trust me to handle my own fight. Tell me what you need from me. Nothing operational. I need you to not fix this. A pause. I need you to be someone I can call when it's handled and tell how it went. Can you do that? It was, he understood completely, the most important question she had asked him since the terrace. More important than whether he'd intended the name of the holding company, more important than any of the honest things they'd exchanged over 3 weeks of lunches. She was asking him to demonstrate in a concrete and costly way that he had actually absorbed what she'd told him, that the pattern he'd built over 8 months of silent intervention was not the pattern she was inviting into her life going forward. Yes, he said, I can do that. He spent the next 4 hours doing something that cost him more than almost anything he'd been asked to do in recent memory. Nothing. He sat with the full knowledge of 3 separate calls he could make that would bury the story within the hour, and he did not make them. He reviewed the documents Ashby had likely used to plant the tip. He had them, naturally. He had most things. And he did not send them to anyone. He trusted her, not as an abstract principle, but as an active, daily choice that required him to be a different kind of person than he'd spent 15 years becoming. The story was retracted by 4 p.m. Meridian's attorney had provided the full donor documentation to the outlet's editorial team, who had immediately identified the misrepresentation in the source data and pulled the piece before the evening news cycle. The anonymous tip was traced, not to Ashby directly, he was careful, but to a communications consultant who had worked for Ashby Capital for 11 years, which was close enough for the outlet's editorial board to issue a public apology and for Ashby's own PR team to spend the rest of the week doing damage control. Sable called him at 4:30. "It's handled," she said. "I know." He had known since 3:15 when his own sources had flagged the retraction. He had waited for her to call. How did it feel? A pause, surprised, he thought, that he'd asked the question rather than commenting on the outcome. "It felt like mine," she said. "That's the difference, isn't it? When I handle it, it belongs to me. When you handle it, it belongs to the fact that you can." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly the difference. And I understand it now in a way I didn't 8 months ago." "What changed?" "You explained it clearly, and I chose to hear it rather than manage it." A pause of his own. "I'd like to take you to dinner." "Not lunch. Dinner with the explicit acknowledgement that I'm asking because I want to spend an evening with you that isn't 3 blocks from either of our offices in the middle of the workday." The sound she made, brief, warm, genuine, settled somewhere in his chest that had been waiting, for considerably longer than he'd fully admitted to himself, for exactly that sound. "Friday," she said, "and I'm choosing the restaurant." "I would expect nothing else." He picked her up at 7 on Friday with no driver and no entourage and a car that was significantly less impressive than what he could have arranged, because he had spent 4 days thinking about what it meant to show up for someone the way they actually needed rather than the way he was capable of, and this felt, in its plain and unembellished way, closer to right. She was waiting outside her building in a green dress that was not trying to apologize for anything, and she looked at the car and at him with an expression that understood exactly the thought behind both. "No driver," she observed. "No driver," he confirmed. "Good," she said, and got in. They didn't talk about Ashby over dinner. They didn't talk about Meridian's finances or his organization's infrastructure interests or the 8 months that had preceded the gala. They talked about her grandmother, who had been the first person to explain to her that financial literacy was a form of self-defense. They talked about his mother, who had believed with a conviction he'd spent years trying to match, that the businesses people built in the margins of the official world weren't lesser than the ones it recognized, only less protected. They talked about the city and what it owed the people it kept finding ways to exclude from its prosperity, and they disagreed about 2 specific things with the easy, undefensive rhythm of people who had enough respect for each other to find disagreement interesting rather than threatening. He walked her to her door at 11:30. She turned to face him on the front step with the same directness she brought to everything. No performance, no ambiguity, just Sable Owens looking at him with her whole face open and unhurried. "You waited 4 days before you showed up," she said. "At the gala. 8 months of watching, and then you moved in 4 seconds. I've been trying to understand that. 8 months of distance was a choice I made based on what I thought you needed. 4 seconds was the absence of choice, the moment when something mattered more than any rule I'd made about it." He held her gaze, steady. "I'm not entirely sure which version of me I'm most comfortable with." "I'll tell you something," Sable said. "The 8 months bothered me. The 4 seconds didn't. I think that tells you something about what I actually need from you, going forward. Less thinking, more presence. More honesty," she corrected gently. "Less managing from a distance. Just show up, Jae-won, not as someone who smooths the path ahead of me, as someone who walks beside me while I do it myself." He reached out and gently tucked a loose curl back from her face, the gesture slow and deliberate and asking permission in its unhurriedness rather than assuming it. "I can do that," he said. "I want to do that. I have wanted for 8 months to be close enough to try." "Then try," she said simply. He did. It was not always easy. 15 years of operational distance doesn't dissolve in 3 weeks of honest lunches, and there were moments in the months that followed where the instinct to intervene quietly and invisibly had to be actively noticed and set aside. But he noticed it every time. He set it aside most times. And the times he got it wrong, she told him plainly. And he heard it. And they moved forward. Meridian grew. The East Side infrastructure stayed funded publicly now, with his name attached and hers consulted on every decision that touched her community. Corbin Ashby had a difficult year. Through no direct intervention from Jae-won, the DA's office found the tax irregularity Sable had identified entirely on their own and ran with it, and the rest unfolded the way these things unfold when the underlying rot is real. And on an evening that was neither particularly dramatic nor particularly significant, a Tuesday in November at the Jollof Rice restaurant 3 blocks from his office, Oh looked across a small table at the woman who had refused at every turn to be managed or protected or loved from a safe and comfortable distance, and understood that the 8 months he'd spent watching from across rooms had been, in the end, the smallest and least meaningful part of what he felt for her. "You're doing it again," Sable said, without looking up from her food. "Doing what?" "Looking at me like you're somewhere outside the room." He picked up his fork. "I was thinking about the city council hearing. October, 14 months ago." "First time you saw me." "First time I saw you," he agreed. "You had 3 minutes and no notes, and you took apart a man with a prepared statement like it was something you did before breakfast." "I did do it before breakfast. I'd been up since 5. "I know," Jae-won said. "I was there." She finally looked up, and the expression she gave him across the small table, warm and clear-eyed and entirely unbothered by being seen, was worth, he thought, every single day of the 8 months that had preceded it and everything that had come after. "You're going to have to stop bringing up the stalking phase eventually," she said. "It wasn't—" He stopped. "Yes," he said instead. "Probably." She laughed, and the restaurant went on around them, and the city outside did whatever the city did. And Jae-won Oh, who had spent 15 years keeping everything that mattered at a careful, survivable distance, ate his jollof rice and stayed entirely, deliberately, gratefully inside the room. If this story moved you, subscribe and drop a comment. We want to know your favorite moment. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.